Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today about the housing crisis we have in Canada and the housing crisis we have in Ontario. At least we're told we have a housing crisis. In fact, in the leaders' debate in the recent federal election, it was one of the heavy topics that was being discussed. How do we address our critical shortage of housing? And that was also carried forward in the provincial election we had recently. How do we solve the housing crisis? And if we go back to 2022, the provincial government came up with what they called More Homes Built Faster Act in 2022, and it was their way of trying to address this shortage of housing. And in fact, in January of 2023, we covered that act. And I want to review it quickly for you. I want to review some of the highlights of it, and we can take a look now that we're well into it, how we're making out. What they set as a goal was to build in Ontario 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years. To put that in perspective, how realistic was it? Well, if you go back over the past 30 years, the best year we've had for housing starts is just at the 100,000 mark. And they're saying we're going to average 150,000 a year every year for the next 10 years. Pretty ambitious. Well, what did they do to try and create a framework to have that happen? Well, they said we're going to require less land for park dedication. Well, they didn't want to say we're just going to, be a concrete jungle. We're not going to be any parks. So they said we're going to take encumbered land like railway tracks, sites, and so on, and we're going to use that for parks so that builders and developers don't have to give up so much land when they're developing a subdivision. We're also going to increase the density that you can put on the land, whereas now it's 300 units per hectare. We're going to bump it up to 600 units per hectare. We're going to reduce the development costs, so there isn't so much impost fees and all the costs that go into bumping up the price of a house. And we're going to, and this was huge, we're going to permit ancillary dwellings. They said, family sizes are getting smaller. People are in houses where they got lots of room, lots of space, and they're house rich and cash poor. So we're going to let them build additional units. First of all, it's granny flats within their house, and you had to be the owner and live there. They relaxed that under Section 299/19 of the Planning Act, and you could have an absentee owner who would kick a building, and he could create a second unit or a third unit in that building, and it could be inside, outside, or a combination thereof. And they also provided grants to help them do that, and they relaxed some of their requirements. For example, they would allow tandem parking, and they overstepped the municipal zoning. It didn't have to be in an R2 or R3 zoning, it could be an R1 zoning. And if municipalities restricted that, they overstepped them. Then they got their wallets out, and they committed $700 million for the Municipal Housing Infrastructure Program and $1.5 billion for the Housing Enabling Water System Fund. And what that was, they said, we understand if we're going to put all these more density of housing, we need to provide fresh water and we need to provide sanitary systems. And so the money was there to do it. All right, so that was in 2022, started to happen in 2023. What effect did it have? Well, in 2023, we saw 89,297 new housing starts. Moving on to 2024, it fell 16% to 74,600. And then I'm going to show you 25, 26, 27, the government's projection. This is their projection. They're saying in 2025, we expect to do exactly the same as we did in 2024, 74,600. In 2026, it'll grow a little bit to 74,800. And then in 2027, we'll bump it up to 82,500. So by their proven and projected figures, that means when they're at the halfway point, halfway into the 5 years, instead of having built 750,000 homes, they'll have built 395,797 homes. Also means that to hit their goal in the final 5 years, they got to build 1.1 million homes or 220,840 homes a year. Bear in mind, the best year ever has been 100,000. That seems unattainable. But what the government has done now is they rolled out another act. It's called the Protect Ontario by Building Faster and Smarter Act. I don't know where they get these titles, 2025. It's a new act that they've just rolled out. And the first thing that they did was they said, we're going to cut red tape. And we're going to simplify and standardize development charges. We're going to remove barriers to manufacturers who are going to come up with any product that will help with the whole building system. For example, if you develop a simpler truss system, which is simpler to make and more cost effective, we will support that industry and help them get online. We're going to simplify and we're going to develop a consistency for building construction standards across the province. We're going to set up an implementation of a Building Transit Faster Act to get municipalities, to get people to be able to move around from point A to point B. We're going to streamline development applications, and we're going to streamline land use planning approvals. And then we're going to develop a legislative framework for building roads and for standards in building roads. And then they said, we're going to put some money behind this. The money we committed at the start, we mentioned in the Build Homes Faster Act in 2022, we're going to top it up with a further $400 million. That's for the Housing Enabling Water System, and it's also for the infrastructure program for municipal housing. They said we're also going to commit $1 billion in low-interest loans to municipalities, give them some capital to work with. And we're going to commit $50 million over the next 5 years to support modular housing. And we're going to give the municipalities the right to reduce taxes on affordable housing up to 35%. So with the top up on the two programs, what they did in 2022, what they're doing now, it brings the total investment up to $2.4 billion for these programs to try and get housing built. Well, what we're seeing is that the housing starts haven't worked out the way they thought. They're not getting the impact they expected. And in fact, if you look, each year, the number of houses being built has decreased rather than increase. Another interesting thing is that the provincial government went to the municipalities and said, we want to create with you some targets for the number of houses built, and we're going to reward you as you hit these targets. And so there's going to be monetary incentives for you to build these homes. In the year 2023, less than half the municipalities hit those targets, even though there was money directly involved, incentive for them to do so. And by October of 2024, of the 50 municipalities, only 11 are on target to meet those. And you could say, well, it's because of Trump and the tariffs, but this has all happened before the election in the South, before Trump got into power. It's nothing to do with that. What it's got to do with is, I think, the economic situation. That's why, in spite of the fact that the government reduced the red tape, put up the incentives and all the rest of it, housing starts are dropping rather than increasing. And in fact, right now, there's 4,525 new home communities in Ontario that are planned, under construction, or completed. There are 1,167 single-family home communities. There are 13,457 floor plans or units that are currently up for sale. The number of vacant new construction homes in the province of Ontario is the highest that it's been in 15 years. And there's 25,893 unsold new condominium units just in Toronto Hamilton. That's 60% higher than the 10-year and the 20-year average. That's now. So these inventories are growing, and we know that too. As it's not that there's a shortage of housing, I believe. It's that there's a shortage of buyers. If we take a look numerically, I don't want to bog you down too much numerically, but we in Canada bring in between 450 and 500,000 immigrants a year. And in fact, if you take a look at Ontario, at the birth rate and the death rate, the net growth is about 28,000 people a year. And so we rely on immigration, and if we bring in 450 to 500,000, if the average composition in the house is say about 4, you're talking about 100,000 housing units needed to handle the growth in the country, both by birth and by immigration, in a year. Well, we're talking about 150,000 coming in Ontario alone. What we're finding is that it's not a housing shortage, I feel, as much as it's a buying shortage. If you're in real estate, you notice that the inventory is growing, and people aren't battling each other like we saw in COVID to buy these houses. They're slowly being taken off the shelf, and more are replacing them more quickly. So it isn't a climate where we need to encourage people to build. It's an economic uncertainty, and that's, I think, why the government understands and is budgeting in very minimal growth and slowly better growth as they see the economy improving. What we need to do, I think, is to create a climate where people can get into the housing market. Now, some people are talking about lowering housing prices. I'd like to see housing prices drop. I, as a realtor, wouldn't like to see that. Sure, our houses are expensive relative to the cost of living and relative to the average wage compared to 50 years ago. I will consent to that. But by the same token, 50 years ago, the mortgage rates were 11.4%, and today they're about 3%, and they're working their way down. So affordability isn't the gap that they would like you to think. But the reason I don't want to see prices drop is because anybody who's bought in the last 3 or 4 years, not only will they lose all their equity, I think at the same time, a lot of these people have been with their factor in their mortgages will literally be underwater. It'll create a huge crisis. I think what we need to do is provide incentives to help people get into housing and help people afford housing, whether we create some kind of a subsidy to their mortgages, whether we work harder, we get rid of the stress test, whether we push down the rate on mortgages to make it more affordable. There was some years ago, I'm not advocating this either, but there were some years ago, we went 3 or 4 years where people could get into a house with nothing down. They didn't require 5% or 10% down to get into a house. And we all know that the toughest thing for everybody is to save that down payment. I think what they need to do is raise consumer confidence. I believe that as we've got the election behind us, now we've got the tariff issue, all these things, as things settle down, as the market begins to pick up, as the economy begins to pick up, as people begin to feel more comfortable, I think you'll find they get back in the marketplace. I'm not opposed to seeing more houses being built, but I think the government's not experiencing what they'd hoped, and I think it's economic reasons. I don't think it's bricks and mortar reason. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. Look forward to talking to you again next week.